No applause. That was just so rough. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Just by raise of hands, how many of you are familiar with the work of George Nakashima? Yeah? And so when you think about his work, what's a word that comes to mind? Just yell it out. Wood. Inspiring? Joinery. Peace. Simplicity. Spiritual. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. We are so fortunate today to be, as Haley said, going on a journey into the world of George Nakashima and the Nakashima Foundation, and the stories that Mira will tell about her father and his work, I hope will evoke some of those qualities that those of you who know about his work have experienced just by seeing them or having them in your homes or seeing them in a museum or something. As Haley said, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. First off, Mira Nakashima is the daughter of legendary woodworker and architect George Nakashima. She herself is an architect, a woodworker, and is currently the director of Nakashima Woodworkers. Mira was born here in Seattle in 1942, but soon after was incarcerated at Minidoka in the Idaho Desert and was released with her parents to a farm in eastern Pennsylvania in 1943. She graduated from Harvard University cum laude in 1963 and received a master's degree in architecture from Waseda University, Tokyo in 1966. She currently serves as a director of the Nakashima Woodworkers in New Hope, Pennsylvania. Our moderator today, who will come out a little later after Mira's talk, is Ken Tadashi Oshima, who is the professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington, where he teaches in the areas of transnational architectural history, theory, representation, and design. He's also been a visiting professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and UCLA. He's a fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians for Lifetime Achievement and served as president of the Society of Architectural Historians from 2016 through 2018. He earned an AB degree magna cum laude in East Asian Studies and Visual and Environmental Studies from Harvard, a master's in architecture degree from UC Berkeley, and his PhD in architectural history and theory from Columbia University. From 2003 to 2005, he was a Robert and Lisa Sainsbury Fellow at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures in London. We're very excited to have both of these folks here with us today at the Gardner Center, and I want to introduce everyone to Mira Nakashima.
Sorry, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. I haven't seen so many people in one room in a long time. So I really am very moved to be here. As you know, I was born in Seattle, but I wasn't here very long because of the incarceration. And we've been in New Hope, Pennsylvania ever since. I never heard of our property described as the estate of George Nakashima, but thank you for that, Haley. We do have about 15 buildings on the property. Some are more sacred than others, I guess. Anyway, thank you for coming. I'm excited to share this with you. It's a whole new presentation because I don't usually speak about sacred spaces. So
can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Oh, here I am. Is that better? Yes, I'm sorry. Now you can't see me. Well, okay. Yes, we should have had a rehearsal for this, but it didn't work out that way. I would like you to, I don't know if this clicker is going to work either. To close your eyes for a moment and to think about, take a deep breath and forget all of the hustle and bustle it took to get you here this morning, and think about what makes a space sacred. I wrote my graduate thesis in Japan on churches, but a sacred space that was confined to a church, which belongs to a particular denomination, defined by a particular liturgical requirements. But I ask you to close your eyes and try to remember the last time you were truly inspired by a place or a space which took you beyond your ordinary existence. Perhaps it was silently standing in a field or by the sea at sunset or under the infinite night sky, walking through a forest, witnessing the seemingly eternal lives of trees, or hearing music flowing all around you, more beautiful than the composers or musicians could have imagined. I challenge you to redefine a sacred space as any place which inspires and uplifts you from your ordinary existence, perhaps as described by my father in The Soul of the Tree, his book, which he wrote in 1981, as he describes hiking through the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. It's a lonely land with long vistas, just this side of Samadhi, the eternal trance. There is an awesome feeling in the immensity, the absolute serenity of those rude lands of passionless silence. I had a sense of viewing creativity at its source. He also spoke of Chartres Cathedral in France as a demonstration of the human spirit, that so much could have been achieved by the citizenry of a small town of Chartres staggers the imagination. Here was a statement to the deep yearning of the human spirit. That's what I was looking for. During his time in Japan, which was in the 1930s, my father worked for Anton and Raymond, and he spoke of the traditional architecture introduced to him by his dear friend Junzo Yoshimura. Lying on our backs in the delicately made tea house, we would empathize with the beautiful graining of the carefully selected cedar boards that had been used for the ceiling. In Kyoto, he enjoyed the fabulously built wooden structures expressing the beauty and eternal quality of the island people of Japan, and the deep reverence these people have for nature, the sweet sadness of never breaking the bonds of nirvana, the elegance and power of simplicity, the beauty of proper materials in building, the delicacy of unfinished wood, the traditional and modern creative proportions where the error of a fraction of an inch can make the design fail absolutely. What seemed necessary to me was to synthesize these traditions with the demands of the contemporary world. Let's see if I have this in the proper order. These are just sort of random photographs I took over a few years. The one on the left is, it's actually just our garage at home. The sun was coming up on the snow, and it was quite beautiful. The little Buddha sitting there is next to our guest house. The tree on the right is a Japanese threadleaf weeping maple, which my grandfather planted in the 1950s. And then there's the little snowdrops just coming up in the springtime. The picture on the left I took when we went on a cruise of Alaska, and it was just wonderful to see all that open space in the wilderness. The photograph in the center is taken in the Catskills. We went up for Obon ceremony, we usually do, to a Zen monastery, and they were lighting the lanterns and setting them free on the lake there. And that's my husband, John Yarnell, in a little chapel that we often go to in Vermont. And here is a lake. I believe it's in Maine. The garden, I think on the right, is from the Rockefeller estate, which I just had a good fortune to visit in Pocanico Hills. And the water lilies on the bottom are in our little pond by the house. And this is, on the left is a chapel in Vermont where we visit, and there's the yard outside the chapel with the sun setting. And on the bottom, we went to visit Chartres Cathedral, and we were allowed to go into the crypt underneath, and that was as sacred a space as the upper part of the cathedral. This is the upper part of the cathedral, which is a familiar sight, and the beautiful stained windows. And here are some of the sacred spaces we visited in Japan. There's a little Buddha in the garden, and very tranquil and quiet, and another temple in Kamakura. And they were all these wonderful sacred spaces until you get a whole bunch of people in them, like on the bottom picture. And that sacredness is just like disappeared. And I have, let's see, I guess I should go into the history a little bit. In 1934, Raymond was commissioned to build a Catholic church in Karuizawa, which I have a picture of later. The experience proved to be fundamental in Nakashima's building methodology and understanding architecture. St. Paul Chapel, what has become known as sustainable architecture, the trees and stone from the site itself became primary building materials. The larger trees, structural members, and the smaller branches of the furnishings within. According to an account in a German magazine, which I had translated because I don't read German, they relied entirely on the expertise of the carpenters to determine the height of the roof, as there were no drawings available until after the completion of the building. So that kind of technique was interesting, and which my father learned in the office of Anton & Raymond, and it's stuck with him the rest of his life. So that's the way he built all his buildings. We don't have total architectural drawings for any of the buildings on the property. He just built them the way they built them in Karuizawa. And then, let's see, maybe I should just go on with these sort of snapshots of what I consider sacred moments. This is a tree. This is one of the rare occasions I actually have a picture of a tree that was standing before we cut it down and made it into lumber. This is an English oak burl tree that was growing in England, and you can see, I think there's that little yellow thing that's about 1 meter long in the middle of the picture. So it's a really wide tree. This is the same log on the sawmill. And to me, I don't know, some of you have been, you're woodworkers, you've seen, gone to a sawmill and seen trees open up, but to me, it's the most amazing thing to see what's inside of a tree that no one has ever seen before. And it's a struggle. I mean, sometimes these trees are really big and heavy, and you have to wrestle them up on the sawmill, and you finally get them open, and there they are. Here's another one, a big hunk of redwood. This is our lumber shed at home. After the trees are sawn and dried, air dried for a while, and then kiln dried, we bring them into what we call the pole barn. This is the only building on the property that my father did not design. We had to build it to house the lumber which he had collected during his lifetime. After he died in 1990, we had nowhere to put it. I thought momentarily of selling it all, and then I realized that this is the legacy from my father. These are the logs that he purchased and milled and wanted to make into something. So we keep trying. This is our main machine shop in the middle of the compound. We have very antique machines. They still work, and they're a lot heavier built than the newer machines are, and a lot easier to fix. This is another transformational kind of operation that happens at Nakashima's. The raw wood, if those of you who have worked with wood, is not usually very interesting. It doesn't look like a whole lot until you get oil on it, and it transforms into this amazing thing. And to me, just being in the finishing room, which isn't anything special, watching this transformation take place makes it a sacred space. This is the church in Karuizawa, which I visited in 2019, just before the pandemic, and it's still, as I say, in use, and very popular and structurally sound. And the man standing by the front of the church there is Kosuke Nagami. He has the wood shop named Sakura Seisakusho in Takamatsu, Japan. They are the only affiliates in the world who are allowed legally to make Nakashima designs, and they do give us a royalty for the designs that they produce. And Dad developed a friendship with them in 1964. This is the interior of that chapel. As I mentioned, the wood came from the property, the stones came from the property, and this is to the right is a stairwell that goes up to the choir loft with these little cutouts with all different kinds of designs. Very simple construction, but very effective. And this is it's not a religious building, but it is a sacred space, which my father was commissioned. He wasn't commissioned. Anton Raymond had the commission to produce in India in 1936, so my father was the architect on site. He was, I guess he said nobody else wanted to go, so he volunteered to become the architect on site for the construction of the first reinforced concrete building in India, a dormitory named Golconda, an experience which proved to change my father's life forever. In describing the life in the ashram, he said the object of the meditation was first to quiet and control the mind. If you've ever tried to do that, it's harder than it sounds. And then in silence, to aspire to unity with the higher divine forces. As the building progressed, he spoke of laborers and craftsmen working together in a common cause with the disciples, noting that when a group of people concentrate with absolute sincerity and devotion to the common objective of a divine life, a creative spirit permeates the group's whole existence. It was an ideal existence on earth without a trace of rancor or harsh words, arguments, egotism, but with all in concert in search of divine consciousness. And he notes that man can participate in this world of silent nature. A jungle can be made into an area of beauty with a certain amount of work, and the transformation calls for the joining together of those who seek something else, who aspire to new lives free from material desire and purer forms than we have ever known. He speaks of the Doric column, the church cathedral, the Katsura detached palace, saying, "We can only believe in the warm golden light in the darkness. That light in the darkness is what I believe distinguishes a sacred space and is only rarely achieved." I didn't realize this was the very first
reinforced concrete building built in India until I went to the show at MoMA last year in New York, and there's a whole lot of really interesting sacred architecture and secular architecture that was built afterwards, but this was the very first one. And this is our studio, the Conoid Studio, which was built from 1958 to 59 with a reinforced concrete conoidal shell. It opens, as you can see, with windows to the south and showcases the trees outside during all seasons. It's open space somehow blessing and inspiring our work as it did my father's. This is a little church in New Hope that my father completely renovated and redesigned in 1960. Unfortunately, the parish outgrew the little space that was there, but I was able, in 2005, I was able to move all these things. They had to be cut down and put in different places, but they're in the new church in New Hope now. But this was a major renovation project in 1960. Oh, and this is a chapel by a native Seattle person. It was named Paul Beluski. It's at the chapel at Portsmouth Priory in Rhode Island. And my father did, I think, 7 different altars for them because they had a number of different priests who had to celebrate Mass every day. So you can't see the Nakashima furniture much in this, but we had a part in it. And it kind of introduced my father to the monastic traditions, and he felt very much at home in different monasteries. This is a church which my father built in 1966 in Japan. It has an hyperbolic paraboloid roof, but it's made out of reinforced concrete, the first of its kind, probably the only of its kind that was built in Japan, and became my ex-husband and my senior project in architectural school when we were at Waseda. They were going to tear it down once we decided they had to leave it up as something that nobody had ever done before and probably never would. This is the interior. And if you look at the ambo, you will see some of the same little cutouts in this church as he had in the Karizawa church. These are elements from Japanese architecture that are kind of reappropriated. And this is the same kind of shell. It's a hyperbolic paraboloid shell, but this building is the arts building on our property in New Hope. Dad was really fascinated with hyperbolic paraboloid shells. The first ones he built were in 1956, and he just was delighted that you could, if they were engineered and built properly, you could have a really open space with no supports in between, and the roof would hold itself up, and that in itself is almost a sacred act. It's not exactly a sacred space, but it's a beautiful space. And it does uplift to the heavens. It's open to the south, nestled in among the trees, and you can see the outside and the rock. And this is chapel that my father built. I put these in more or less chronological order, but he, as I told you, he became interested in the monastic traditions when he was working at Portsmouth Priory, and he became friendly with one of the monks there, and the monk got tired of being where he was, It was too many people, and he wanted to go out to his desert community and build something remote with a bunch of cells for a very limited number of monks. So my dad went out with him, and they used, I guess you would call it indigenous architecture. They used the rocks and the mud from the property itself to build this chapel and the cells, the original cells. As you can see, it's a cruciform plan. The Benedictines do a lot of chanting, antiphonal chanting, so they sit on opposite sides of the chapel, and the visitors would sit on near the front entrance. But it's an amazing space because you can see the outside through the clerestory windows all around the chapel. So this is the approach to the monastery through down a really bad 13-mile dirt road, which you don't dare to try to drive on, and if it's raining, because you'll fall off a cliff. But this is, if you're successful, this is where you get to. Oh, I think I got too many of those. But this, the picture on the left is the main entrance to the chapel, and you can see that you can see the canyon and the sun and the rain and whatever is happening outside. You see through all four windows in the chapel area, and it's quite beautiful. I don't know if you're familiar with the Benedictines, but they have 8 services. The first one starts at 5 in the morning, and that's usually pitch black, especially in the wintertime. And they go through the day, and every service they go through, there's a different landscape coming in, visible on the outside when they're in there. And my husband and I have visited here more often than any other churches, so I have more pictures than anything else. And it's not just the inside, it's not just the interior, but it's the outside and the setting, the relationship of the inside to the outside, which makes this a really special sacred space. There's another chapel that my father designed with local materials. It's a Guanajuato roof. This is in Mexico, outside of Mexico City, and it's called La Soledad. There's a picture of my brother Kevin when he was much younger. Oh, and this is the tea room inside of one of our buildings, the reception house. It's a 4.5 mat tea room, and that's the tokonoma, it's almost a sacred space. It can be used as a sacred space, but we've done tea ceremony in here. And the tea ceremony itself is a way of honoring each other and respecting each other, and the space supports that activity. Oh, these are from Japan. There is a very large table in Ritsurin Park in Takamatsu. And our friends, the Nagamis, have the Sakura Seisok show, and they had this. I don't know if you're familiar with Ben Shawn. He was an artist who was a very dear friend of my dad's, and he did this sculpture. His son did the sculpture of my father, and the Nagamis put it up at the entryway of their showroom. But it's almost a sacred space going in there and seeing this bigger than life-size head of my father staring at you. And the picture on the right is their showroom in Tokyo. So if you ever go to Tokyo, that's an easier way to see Nakashima furniture than going to Takamatsu. Oh, and I would just what makes a place sacred? What makes a space sacred? The picture on the left, I don't know if some of you are familiar with Joseph Walsh, the Irish woodworker, but we were invited to a symposium at his place last year, and then we were staying in this little village, and there's this Irish rainbow out our window. So that was a sacred moment. The little chapel in the center is a shrine near an Orthodox church, which my husband attends near us. And this messy thing on the right is our butsudan at home. I have pictures of my brother and my dad, and I think it was shortly after my brother passed that we had lots of flowers. And this is our peace altar project. This one is in New York City, and it's in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. If you're ever in New York, I suggest that that a sacred space is not just defined by the architecture, but it's defined by the furniture within it. And my father had this dream in 1984 that he had this big log that his logger wanted to sell him, and he wanted to make sure that it went to a good use. And so he had this dream that he would make peace altars for each of the continents of the world. And I was just in Oregon visiting one of my sons there, and we went to the Portland Japanese Garden, and it turns out that the Portland Japanese Garden is having symposia all around the world for gardens, of course, gardens as a way of achieving peace, but also programs for peace and art for peace and cultural programs and so forth. And I was pretty excited. He was interested in what we do, and we were interested in what he did. So I hope that we will eventually be able to place peace altars on each of the continents of the world, and perhaps travel with programs like that. Whoops, sorry. So this is the second peace altar. My father made the first one, which I showed in the first slide. He made that in 1986, and it's at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. This is the second one, which we made for the 50th anniversary of the UN in 1996, I believe it was. No, 1995. And this was its dedication at the cathedral. It finally went to the Hague Appeal for Peace in 1999 and eventually got to the Moscow Academy of Arts in 2001, but this is its dedication, which was done with not exactly all religions of the world, but people from a lot of different places and a lot of different belief systems were standing around that altar when it was dedicated. And that's the way life should be. This is a picture of it when it was at the Hague. They had thought they would have it in a special room at the Hague, but it was too big, so it ended up in the entryway, and people would stop by and leave things like cranes and light candles and sprinkle petals on it. And this is the one we made for India, which went in 1996 to the Hall of Peace in Auroville, India. It's outside. It's the newer city that was built by the mother of the ashram, Mira where my father studied and worked and thought he was going to stay for the rest of his life. So it seemed appropriate to send a peace altar there. And they use it more for secular purposes, but they say that it's about I think 10.5, 11.5 by 11.5. So it's a big table. I made this one at a lower height so they could sit on the floor and meet around it. Sometimes they do meditations. Obviously, they've put flower petals there too. Some of my family is there, and some of our friends from the U.S. All went on a trip to India to pay our respects to that peace altar. My husband's there on the far left, and my oldest son is there on the right. And my one grandson is there right by the candle. So I think that's the end, yes. So thank you very much. So I think we're going to have a Q&A now.
Thank you so much for that inspiring Hello? Okay. Well, welcome home, Mira.
Thank you.
It's
good
so
to be
wonderful
here.
to have you here in Seattle and rejoin after a challenging, maybe 3 years, to have this very sacred moment all together. We first met physically, I think, in St. Albans Chapel in Tokyo. 23 years ago, perhaps,
24,
or 24,
yeah.
which was designed by Antonin Raymond, and all these different links. At that point, I was doing work on my dissertation on the Raymonds, and that would lead to many different connections, bringing us here today. But in hearing the profiles of us, you might not quite understand the various links, but my classmate in architecture school at Berkeley was Maria.
Only architect in the next generation of Nakashimas.
Exactly, and having graduated in 1963 from Harvard, that was 25 years before I graduated also in architecture, and so I wouldn't have believed that it would all kind of connect in this amazing way to come to Seattle to teach at the University of Washington, where George Nakashima attended. And so really kind of coming full circle to this point in the Pacific Rim that really looks to Asia, as well as how we can have this kind of global perspective through the sacred spaces that you showed today and inspired us. And I think there are many links that are kind of underlying this and ways that inspire us. You probably have sat on some of the Nakashima furniture if you went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in the Japanese galleries. You probably sat on one of the Nakashima chairs and the table there. That becomes interesting of the work being Japanese or Japanese American or American, and really bringing us into a much broader context, I think, and seeing the context of the Chartres Cathedral. I think it's very interesting in researching more on George Nakashima's career and life, how he was in France, right, before going to Japan to be in Antonin Raymond's office. And so the way that that experience in France kind of shaped a perspective in Japan vis-a-vis his time here in the Pacific Northwest. And so there are many different lenses, I think, that kind of shape this, but ultimately how we feel this, as you really inspiringly showed us. But I know we were talking a little bit before, and just all these different points of connection. Actually, we were together in 2019 at St. Paul's Chapel, in Karuizawa, and seeing that from the perspective of Japan. Here, actually, I was also reflecting, I did my PhD at Columbia, and the chapel next to the architecture school, St. Paul's, also has the
It's a mini peace table.
mini peace table, as well as the
Or peace altar it is there, yeah.
in the Kent Hall, the Asian Studies, the Donald Keene Center has the Nakashima room with the furnishings and really creating that space through that vision. And so I think we've been all shaped in all different ways, but through these multiple experiences. And so, but coming back to Seattle, I think it's such a profound experience of what this is, the climate, the people, and being born here at this particular moment. I wonder if you can share with us a little bit more about that time. I mean, you were not cognizant of everything at that time, but through knowing what your father was doing and so forth, some of these links to Seattle and also the artistic community that is really rich.
Well, as Ken said, I was born here in 1942, just before the incarceration. My cousin Craig is in the audience here. He was born in camp shortly after I was, and we were both too little to remember very much of the experience. We were grateful that we didn't have to spend a lot of time in camp. The Raymonds had left Japan and came back to the USA by way of South America and Europe. It was a very circuitous route because they weren't supposed to come directly from Japan to the US during wartime. But they ended up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and my dad's professor at MIT, he got his graduate degree in architecture at MIT. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah, okay. Noticed that we were incarcerated, and if the deal was during World War II, if you had a sponsor on the East Coast who guaranteed to keep you out of trouble, they would let you out of camp. So Mr. Raymond petitioned for my father to come and work on his farm. He was working on architectural projects, he was working on government projects, so Dad was not allowed to work as an architect. He was allowed to work as a chicken farmer. Well, that was better than being in camp. So we packed up our stuff. Dad was very good friends with Morris Graves during, when was he here? 1942, I guess. He came up, he was married in 41 in California. I go back a little bit, when he was coming back from India because of the war, and he realized that his family was all in the U.S., he stopped off. He had this round-the-world steamship ticket, which he had bought shortly after graduated from MIT in 1930, because he couldn't earn a living. So he bought this steamship ticket with open-ended time on it, and that's how he got to Japan. That's how I was working with Raymond. And then he decided to come back, and he just by accident, when he returned to Japan from India, he met my mother, who had also been born and brought up in Seattle. They met in Tokyo and were engaged, and were married in Los Angeles. And then they moved up to Seattle, and Dad decided to, on the way, he saw a Frank Lloyd Wright building under construction, decided if that's the way they're doing it in the USA, he didn't want to be an architect anymore. He was going to make furniture. So, well, he said it was the same thing as architecture, only smaller. So, and luckily, he did learn quite a bit when he was in Japan, working with the Raymond office. But he got here, and he didn't have enough money to buy a full set of machines and actually go into furniture manufacture. He'd never really made furniture even. It was pretty gutsy to think that he could do that. But there was a Maryknoll missionary by the name of Leopold Tibesar, who had the Maryknoll, I don't know whether the center, I guess, in Seattle. And he said that my father could use the machinery for his boys' club if Dad would teach them how to do woodworking. So that's how he got started in Seattle. And thanks to the Maryknoll missionaries, and I guess Dad felt obligated to become a Catholic because of the favor, so he became a Roman Catholic. I could never figure out why he was a Roman Catholic when he'd had all this enlightened experience in India first, but I think he was indebted to the Maryknoll missionary, who also commissioned the reinforced concrete church in Kyoto in the 1960s. But anyway, so then we were, he was just sort of getting his feet on the ground with his little furniture business, and then we were incarcerated. But he was really fortunate that he and a trained Japanese carpenter were allowed to work side by side to help make our barracks more livable. And so he learned a lot about Japanese carpentry during the internment. He was grateful for that. And then he was grateful for, being invited to New Hope, Pennsylvania. And so he decided rather than come back here after the war, just to stay there and make his life in Pennsylvania. So that's what happened.
Such a global journey, but yet based here. And when you were showing the St. Paul's Chapel in Karuizawa, we were looking at the one of the original chairs from the chapel that was with Noemi Raymond, Antonin's partner, and George. And this collaboration with the carpenters to create this, and how important the furnishings are for this space, but also the translation of these ideas to make it fit in these spaces. And one of the interesting things in that chapel is for the stained glass. They didn't have much money, and rather than in shards with the stained glass, they used Japanese rice paper, washi, in these circular and triangular geometric patterns. And it was interesting then seeing the Katsura Catholic Church in Kyoto to translate some of those ideas further in the context of that church in 1966, and use rice paper in this geometric pattern. But also in this context, it's not far from the famous Katsura Imperial Villa that many of you know very well as a kind of paradigm of Japanese architecture, but be unique in terms of this geometric form, but the sensitivity to the materials of reinforced concrete, etc. But giving a kind of new light on that. But having been involved in that project as a young architect from the perspective of Waseda, I wonder if you have any further memories of that time, or of just the experience of actually working in Japan, and how that was unique.
Oh, well, I was really grateful that my father sent me on my first trip to Japan after I graduated from Harvard. And by the way, I was among the first class of women to get Harvard degrees in 1963. But I went with Alan Watts on my first trip to Japan. So I had this really intensive Zen Buddhist introduction to Japan with Alan Watts, and very grateful for that. But I stayed on, and when I first went there, I got off the plane. I thought, oh my gosh, everybody has the same color hair as me. They're all the same height, and I would go shopping, and the clothes actually fit. It was a whole good experience. But I didn't speak a word, and I looked like I should. It was very embarrassing. So I studied Japanese intensively until the term began in April. Is that when they begin in Japan? April usually, yeah. So and then I got to architectural school, and I had gone to Harvard, and it was architectural sciences. I never had any drafting training. All of my classmates had 4 years of hard drafting with a T-square and triangle and all those little instruments. So I was way behind, and thank goodness my classmates wanted to learn English, because they helped me along. They were still really good friends. But it was the atelier system. So we worked with Kenji Imai, who had done he was, I don't know who he was a student or just a devotee of Gaudi.
I think a devotee.
Yeah, but he'd done a lot of these crazy sort of sculptural architecture things that we had to help him with. The most memorable was he did the Imperial Music Hall in the middle of Tokyo, and we students were allowed to go up and help. And he did these mosaic on the wall made of broken pottery. So we'd go up there and break pottery and stick it in the wall. So that was a good experience, but it was hands-on experience in an architectural site. And so that we had this project that my father had conceived of and made arrangements for in Kyoto, and we spent a lot of time. My classmates and I did the drawings and worked with the engineering department at Waseda and worked with the construction people, and that was really good experience, hands-on from the ground up.
Which you really continue the production of the Nakashima work in Takamatsu, as you mentioned, with the Sakura workshop.
Sakura Seisok Show,
Seisok
how does
Show,
that
yeah.
translate?
I guess in Takamatsu
Factory?
the factory, I think is very unique. Those of you who visited that Takamatsu area, you might know that that's in the area of the studio home of Isamu Noguchi.
Yeah.
In Murray, just kind of off of that. And that's actually where the Black Sun, right in front of us, was
Made.
crafted and then shipped over here. The donut is still there if you want to. That's in the middle of that. Still, you can visit that. But these connections of how it's crafted but envisioned in different ways. And I think Noguchi also has this kind of dual perspective of looking from America and from Japan. And actually, I think the temple that you showed of Kamakura, Engakuji, that's where Noguchi's father had spent time and wrote a very interesting work on the moon. And so it's interesting to have the black sun out in front here, in terms of the sacred space and the light that inspires us. But with this and the kind of particular perspectives that you have, I think one thing that's really unique that you mentioned is this kind of lower perspective of the furnishings, as opposed to a tall chair, and there is the Mira chair, but the kind of lower perspective that you have that's closer to being like on the tatami mat and so forth. But for you, how does this particular perspective shape not only kind of how you see the space, but also a kind of quality that you really continue in the design of being unique?
When my father was working in India, he studied with Sri Aurobindo. I mean, he was his boss as well as his spiritual master. And they believe that karma yoga, which is the yoga of doing, is every bit makes your work every bit as sacred as prayer or chanting or any other so-called religious activity. Your work is your devotion, is your way of connecting to the divine. And we try to keep that spirit alive in our workshop. Some people are more sensitive to it than others, but it is a universal spirit which I think connects all people in the craft world. Somehow your hands and your heart and your mind and your spirit are all connected when you're working with your hands in a good way. And we try to keep that spirit alive and remember that when we're working in the shop in all phases. Maybe not the bookkeeping department so much, but those of us in the design department respect the forms of nature and what has gone before us, and try to send that out in the world. My husband is much more devoted to spiritual things than I am, and he works on chairs. And Soetsu Yanagi was the beginning with the voice of the Minge craftsman in the 1920s, and he talked about the variety of sameness. I mean, if you're creating pottery particularly and you're making a series of cups or bowls or something, it looks like it's the same thing going on over and over again. It looks like it's really boring, but every moment is a different moment than the time you did it before. The material is a little bit different, and your body and your mind are in a different place when you're doing it. So he talks about the variety of sameness, and it's, I think it's a very important concept. And in the West, everybody wants everything to be new and different. When I studied design at Harvard, my professor Mirko Balsadella would go by. He wasn't there when you were there, I guess, but he didn't speak much English. But he did not like things that were the same. He wanted you to make it all different. But in Japan, it's an acceptable and desirable thing actually to do work so that you're meditating while you're working, and it's not the Western way, and it's not the normal way of making money in the USA, but so far we've been able to keep going. So.
It's interesting you mentioned Yanagi and this kind of notion of continuity, I would say, instead of copying, and change. Yanagi is famous for the butterfly stool that is made from the bent wood, but it connects to some of the chairs of the Eames and others, and yet it's in a very distinctive shape, I think, and how that particular personality can shape in the scale of that something unique.
That's Sori Yanagi. That's the son of Soetsu Yanagi.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
Who, when we met, he would always say, "I'm sorry," and as if he's apologizing, but he is sorry, Yanagi. But he always had a sense of humor. But you might have seen his designs in the Kikkoman soy sauce bottles that he's very famous for, or the glass sake cups that are everywhere. That's universal in that way, but yet there's something unique. And just as in the Nakashima work, there's something universal in the wood, but then there's something really unique in terms of the craft and the personality and the scale and how that all comes about.
And each person will do it differently too. Even though it looks like the same chair, if different people make it, it feels different.
Well, actually, for those of you who don't know the Mira chair, I wonder if you can explain a little bit about how the Mira chair came about.
I don't know. I was like 9 or 10 when the Mira chair was first invented, but I think it has very strong shaker roots. It looks very much like one of the shaker chairs that has 4 legs instead of 3, which my father eventually made also because my little brother kept falling off of the 3-legged chair. But what was I going to say about? So it's on the same trip when I first met Ken in Japan. My cousin John Terry was doing a Nakashima documentary, which some of you may or may not have seen, but it's available online through Nakadoc, through the Nakashima documentary. But we interviewed a lot of different people. We were hoping to interview. Actually, we did interview Sori Yanagi, and all he talked about was garbage. He says the world today just creates too much garbage. We got to do something about this. But then I asked him, I said, well, how do you reconcile this whole idea of the Mingei tradition, which his father was explaining and was so passionate about, with his mass production? And he says, well, I make the originals by hand, and then they take them and mass produce them. So, and that's the whole tenet of Mingei, was to make things by hand, but to make it accessible to all people. So he says that's the only way you can do Mingei in the modern day, is to make a prototype by hand and then mass produce it so it's inexpensive enough that people can afford. So that was interesting.
It's interesting you mentioned garbage because and also that the Katsura Catholic Church has been preserved. It's wonderful. One of the challenges in Japan is with a kind of notion of temporality, things are built but torn down constantly. And you see in Issei Shrine the rebuilding every 20 years, and also the destruction. But what can survive, and the kind of longer term of whether it be adaptive reuse or how that is really preserved through the traditions, but also really respecting the materials on a longer scale. And so in looking at the Nakashima studio, how is it today in kind of preserving the legacy, but also moving forward? And it's such a special site that we saw at the beginning and through the Konoid studio. But in keeping this alive, I wonder, from your perspective, what are the kind of ideals, but also challenges?
Well, it's a challenge when you have buildings that, the first ones were built in 1947. They need repair and renovation. But the exciting thing that I see on our near horizon is we're working with the University of Pennsylvania to do an energy audit, and they're trying to change the way our sources of energy so that we become sustainable and that we don't have to buy all of that oil for the heaters and all the electricity for our machinery, that we will be able to generate it on site with geothermal and solar and whatever else they come up with. But that will be a sort of a long-term project. But I'm looking forward to. I don't think we're going to have windmills, but we will have sustainable sources of energy very, very soon. So.
Well, actually, I know one of the individuals involved in the research on the Nakashima studio and estate, Bill Whitaker, who is also the curator of the architectural archives, my colleague, but also will be, I think, a speaker here in June, speaking about Louis Kahn and the sacred spaces there, which again have connections with the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania region. I know at the Fisher house that Louis Kahn designed, there were Nakashima chairs that were signed, Mr. Fisher told me. But how we understand this in so many living ways.
So maybe we should ask people for questions?
Absolutely. So I think we have time to open up for questions that you might be dying to ask. And here we are.
Was George Nakashima a student of... Oh, excuse me. Was George Nakashima a student of Raymond? What's the relationship between the two?
Oh, he was an employee of Raymond's from 1934 to 38. He worked on several buildings in the Tokyo area with Mr. Raymond, and then he was sent over to India.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
I know several of those people you mentioned. Raymond was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And my relatives was an architect in Tokyo. He worked under Raymond. So
What
he
was
may
his name?
know
Yeah.
George Nakashima too.
What is his name?
His name is Jack Curtis.
Jack Curtis.
Oh.
Do you know him?
No, I don't.
yeah,
It sounds
sorry,
familiar, though.
I know the name. Yes.
Name?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Then he and the Junzo Yoshimura
Yeah.
was also worked with Raymond, right?
Yes.
Jack knew Junzo, and in fact, I have a copy of the book, Junzo's work, and he signed it with his letter to Jack.
Oh,
And
yeah.
When Jack died, I got the book with
Oh,
his letter.
lucky you. Yeah,
It's kind of interesting, the relationship.
yeah.
I also went myself to the sculptor's studio.
Noguchi?
Noguchi, yeah. He was a lover of Mexican artists, right?
I think, yeah.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah,
They
okay.
had an affair. And let's see. He was also a friend of Khan and worked with Larry Harper in San Francisco.
Yeah, I don't know all
You
of
don't
those
know
people.
them.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good enough.
Yeah. But Junzo Yoshimura was a very important
I was just curious.
connection. Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, we just published a book on the Japanese house that was on display at the Museum of Modern Art in 1954, 55, which is now in Philadelphia, Shofuso, and the links to Yoshimura and Nakashima. And so, those of you who are interested, there's a whole other story to be told. But
Well, I'm sure Bill will
Yeah.
touch on that.
but I wonder if there's some other questions.
Can you tell us about the beautiful jacket you're wearing?
Oh, thank you. I was giving a talk. I think we had a show at the Mingei Museum in San Diego, and they had it in their gift shop. Thank you.
Mira, I just
Yes.
wanted to say how much I enjoyed your insightful remarks
Oh.
and the warmth with which you talk about your father and his work, and how wonderful it is that you're preserving the tradition and carrying it forward.
Thank
really,
you.
Really is wonderful. And Ken, I have a broad question for you. I'd love to hear you sort of define George Nakashima's aesthetic in the context of 20th century architecture and furniture design.
It's very interesting. As you know, it is globally important. But we look at all of these links of the Nakashima furnishings, not only as furniture, but I think as architecture and design, as it creates space and these links. So, you know, historically we can see links to folk craft movements through Yanagi, and actually Yanagi Sori collaborated closely with Charlotte Perriand, the French designer, and so how these fusions would come about, or with the Eames, and so in this really rich connection of design through these personal experiences, you see how much that has shaped the actual spaces that you experience. And so, you know, I think what's so amazing about the Nakashima design is, you know, as you sit, you understand the space materially, physically, but also conceptually, that links to the place, but also so many other memories and sensitivities. And so, you know, I think it's at the heart of 20th to 21st century design that you can actually experience, which I think is sacred.
Oh, yeah. I think my father's architecture has been somewhat neglected and underrated in proportion to the furniture, because he earned his living and became famous as a furniture maker. But I was always impressed that his architecture I mean, he didn't do much architecture except for those two monasteries off-site. The rest of them were just kind of experiments in his own property, because he could control the building, you know, every day. He was on site telling him what to do next, which is how he got away without a complete set of drawings.
And I think, if you visit the Konoid studio, you understand how materials can work on a large scale in terms of the structure and a smaller scale in terms of furnishings and, supporting you and supporting the space. And, but actually, you know this very well, Mira, the furnishings can be a much harder design challenge than architects often design terrible chairs that are uncomfortable,
Well, Frank Lloyd Wright said it was part of the architecture. It didn't have to make people comfortable.
And so how you actually feel in it becomes so important.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is off of Highway 9 near Arlington. There's the Nakashima Heritage Barn. And I just wondered if that had much significance to you personally or resonates within your family at all. I think it's a link to George Nakashima. There was a dairy, a former dairy involved. We happened to drive by it one day, and it's a very beautiful structure. And I just wondered if it resonates at all with you.
I didn't even know what it was. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Sorry.
worth visiting if you happen to be nearby.
It has something to do with our family?
Yes, I believe so. I looked it up, and there's a very small, it seems like a somewhat tangential connection, but there was a dairy business that I mean, I remember looking it up and seeing a connection to George Nakashima. And again, if I got it wrong, I apologize.
Oh,
but,
that's okay.
and
I don't know anything about it.
Okay.
Thank you.
My second question is sort of toward the end of your father's life. Did you have a sense of sort of what his spiritual beliefs may have been, or which tradition he felt most aligned with?
Well, as I said, he became a Roman Catholic. He was nominally a Roman Catholic, but he didn't go through any instruction. The priest said, "Oh, you've always been a Catholic. It's okay." So we always felt that he had a very. There was a Buddhist priest who was a friend of ours who insisted that he had to do a Buddhist ceremony for Dad after Dad passed away because he thought he was Buddhist, and he was always a disciple of Sri Aurobindo, and that had nothing that precluded him belonging to any other religion. So he wanted to be considered a citizen of the world, and I think a believer of I don't know what he believed in, but it wasn't restricted to Catholicism, and that's the way life should be.
Yes. I thought his exploration of spiritual, his whole journey was so interesting, and he was so strenuously devoted to that in a very admirable way.
I think maybe there's time for one last question.
Oh gosh.
Over some.
So I think before the pandemic, we're part of a walking group, and one of the places we were walking was Magnolia, and there's a beautiful library there. I think it was done by Paul Hayden Kirk originally, and I think there's quite a bit of George's furniture in that library.
Yeah.
So I guess this is not exactly a question, but if anybody wants to go and actually sit on your father's furniture, I think there's stuff there, and I think they preserve it very nicely.
Yeah, there are. I don't remember exactly when it was put there, but there are Nakashima pieces. Also, I forgot to mention the fact that towards the end of my father's life, he was awarded the Summa Laude Dignatus from University of Washington, and he had had a stroke the year before, and he was just so excited that he was going to get this award from the University of Washington. Every morning he would wake up, he said, "Is it time to go yet?" So he finally got there. I think it was maybe it was the beginning of June or something, and he finally got there, and he was sad because he couldn't stand up to receive it. He had to be wheeled in a wheelchair, but he got his degree from UW. And then he came back home, and he died shortly after that. So that was his great, achievement to come back to University of Washington and get this award here. So
So there's so much. Oh, one last.
You know, I am not sure which building it was, but it makes a good story. I think it was not so much the building itself, but it was the way it was built. After having been in Japan, when everything is very precise and the joints are fitted so carefully, and they were just, he went on a building site and they were just nailing 2x4s together, and it didn't, you know, and then whatever they put on the outside was like show stuff. It wasn't real. The structure was just really sloppy. So he didn't like that as much as. Huh? In the U.S., yeah, somewhere in California.
If you see the Katsura Catholic Church, that concrete wall, I think, is so finely crafted, you know, in expressing the material, building on what Antonin Raymond did, but you see it also in the Pondichere ashram, and you know, a real precursor to what you'll see with Ando's work in church architecture. And so for those of you joining the next installment, you'll see the further kind of contrast in the perfection of that concrete. That's very different from the kind of material character, I think, that you'll see in the Katsura Catholic Church. And hopefully some of you will be able to visit that in person. But I think we're at time. I think also there is a book that came out recently, and will be available. I think there'll be information online about how you can get it.
Yeah, I had an assistant designer who said with our old catalog had pictures of actual pieces that were made, and people would look at the pictures and say, I want one exactly like that, and they're all different. So it got to be problematical, and she said we should write a process book. So this is our process book, and it was tough because there are a lot of my dad's original sketches, and they wanted me to fill in with my sketches, and they just didn't shape up. But hopefully it's okay. It's just published. It was published in Europe and is recently available. So thank you for that.
Please join me in giving a round of applause to Mira and Ken. And thank you. Thank you, Mira, for sending us in the spirit of George Nakashima.